Hey, everybody. If you're listening to this, you are listening to the first free hour of this episode of The Shift with Doug McKenty. If you like what you're hearing, please consider subscribing to the show in order to access the full feature-length versions of the podcast, as well as have access to the members forum, where we discuss potential topics and interviews and dive deep into the overall concept of the shift. For only $6 a month, not only do you get the full-length episodes, but also an opportunity to co-create with me, your host, Doug McKenty, the future of the show. Go to www.theshiftnow.com or patreon.com/theshift and sign up today in order to help make the shift possible. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show. Good morning, noon, or night, whenever and wherever you are listening to The Shift. I'm your host. My name is Doug McKenty. This episode was recorded on September 14th, 2021. Enjoy this conversation with independent journalist and political analyst Niko House. Niko hit the independent media scene in 2014 with the premiere of his program Mi Casa Su Casa on YouTube and quickly became a leading progressive African-American voice within that space. Though initially identifying with other more established left-leaning outlets such as the Young Turks, his unique perspective and powerful critical thinking skills caused a rift after the 2016 Democratic primary showed powerful evidence of being rigged in favor of Hillary Clinton and against progressive favorite Bernie Sanders. Like many progressives at the time, Niko became aware of the depths of entrenched corruption within the political process. His reporting now reflects the feelings of many left-leaning individuals alienated by the traditional left-right paradigm, and his views have evolved to include a marked distrust of both corporate and government stakeholders. While still identifying as left-leaning, his views are insightful and well worth paying attention to by progressives and populists alike. Mi Casa Su Casa now represents a powerful unifying voice from outside traditional political boundaries from an African-American perspective. I initially invited Niko onto the show to have that uncomfortable conversation about race. Clearly, the Trump-era mainstream media narrative inundated American culture with the notion that white supremacy and white nationalism were steadfast characteristics of many Trump supporters, and white America was introduced to concepts such as white privilege, critical race theory, and anti-racism. Lines were drawn as many felt it was virtuous to pursue these concepts with a fervor, while others felt attacked and censored for supporting alternative perspectives concerning racial equality. The killing of George Floyd and subsequent Black Lives Matter uprising resulted in a dramatic bifurcation of American society not seen since the 1960s. Though there was no shortage of political commentary on the issue at the time, very little included personal, mature conversation between representatives of different racial groups. Ironically, most simply pitted white against white in an effort to discern the best way to treat people of color going forward. Stay tuned for this conversation between a white man and a black man as we discuss our personal experiences concerning white privilege and systemic racism, delve into the root causes of the issue, and seek realistic and mutually beneficial solutions. Find out more about the work of Niko House on YouTube on the Niko House and the MCSC Network channel, on Rockfin at www.rockfin.com/Niko, or connect on Twitter at NikoCSFB. As always, find out more about The Shift, sign up for the newsletter, or subscribe to feature-length versions of the program at www.theshiftnow.com. If you like what you're hearing, please like, subscribe, and share this episode throughout your social media network. We rely on listeners like you to distribute this material. I want to thank Niko House for agreeing to participate in this intimate conversation about race, and thank you for helping to make the shift. Hey, everybody, and welcome to the show. This is the 94th episode of The Shift. I'm your host, Doug McKenty. I'm happy to be joined today by Niko House of the MCSC Network. He's got a show coming up on RT, actually, in about a month from now. So happy to have him on the show, help him tell people a little bit about that. I had Niko on the show. I've been wanting to have this conversation for a long time. When I first emailed him about this, I told him I wanted to have that uncomfortable conversation about race, because when the whole thing started happening under Trump a few years back, everybody started talking about white privilege, it became really apparent that in order to have an actual conversation, I needed to actually speak with an African American person, and we needed to have this conversation about what racism is, how it affects people. What is my situation as a white person in terms of this concept of white privilege? I just wanted to really hash this out, and Niko agreed to come on the show and have this conversation with me. So thank you so much, Niko. I hope this is a good conversation. Actually, I hope it's really interesting.
I'm sure it will be. I'm sure it will be. And you know what's funny about that? First of all, thank you, because usually when white people, especially guys, want to have a conversation about white privilege, it's just like between two white guys talking about white privilege.
Right.
Like I'm like, so nobody sees the problem with this. Like, oh, okay, I guess whatever.
Right.
I'll just sit back and learn from you guys then, I guess. And it's funny because a lot of the times it's two white guys that I actually know personally. You just in the independent media world, it's like, sure, yeah, we're gonna have this cover either because like sometimes, you'll see the idea of privilege or race weaponized, right? Where somebody's trying to take a moral high ground, and then I'm like, whoa, that's not what we're talking about. That's not what we're talking about. And then other times you see people like, well, I have no idea what you're talking about. That's not how it is to be black at all. And I'm like, well, why the fuck would you know, bro? Like, exactly. I'm not saying like everybody has a clear understanding of any of these ideas, and I get that, but like at least try to bring somebody on who can actually speak from their own perspective. Yeah, that's a problem in, because some conservatives do that. They'll, everybody tokenizes at this point. Some conservatives are guilty of it. A lot of liberals at this point are even more guilty of it. But then when it comes time to have that real conversation, those who have a genuine understanding get left out of the conversation. So everybody is the worst, more for the worse after that, instead of like having, the conversation that we're having here.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, another thing, just to kind of get going with it. Well, actually, I guess, do you want to let the audience know here at the beginning a little bit about your history and your show and what's going on? We'll get that out of the way, and then we'll dive into it.
So my history is 2016. I started the largest Bernie organization in the country while I was at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I was also the state director and the president of North Carolina Colleges for Bernie too. And then by way of that, I accidentally discovered some fraud, election fraud, and we got really popular, and we started the Dnc Fraud Lawsuit, which got all the way to the Supreme Court, and coincidentally enough was kicked out by Clarence Thomas right after Joe Biden got nominated. So if you don't know that story, go ahead and look that up. But basically, how everybody's aware at this point of whenever the attorney argued on behalf of the DNC and said that they could choose their candidate in a smoke-filled room, behind closed doors. That was that lawsuit. And so, Jared and Liz were the attorneys on that. Jared Beck and Elizabeth Liebeck were the attorneys on that.
I have interviewed Jared in the past, so that episode's available.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're amazing. Brilliant. He's absolutely brilliant. And then at some point in between all that, I ended up getting my own radio show on iHeartRadio, and then started my own YouTube channel, and, then became a Tulsi surrogate and a lot of stuff. I did a lot of activism and organizing between that. And now I have my own media network, independent media network, MCSC network, but I also have, I will have my own show on RT, but I do a lot of interviews on RT, and my segments are oftentimes go on RT. Like I have interviews for them, and or conduct interviews for them, and I do segments for them now. And then we're working on a TV show at the moment too. It's going to be like a panel discussion of like different opinions, really having harder conversations than what we have. Like I'm gonna try to even push the envelope for what's considered normal even for RT, right? Like we have a conversation, for example, about vaccines. Because of the Sputnik vaccine, Russia itself is actually a very pro-vaccine country. I guess when your vaccine doesn't have a shitload of side effects and it's actually made of technology that's been around for a while, you don't have to worry about that. But that was something that, like, obviously as an American, with my own unique experiences with the vaccines, it wasn't as cut and dry. And we had like a little pushback amongst some of the producers, and what I wanted to do for to cover Pfizer and Moderna making over like 50 billion this year estimated with for the vaccine, as they're getting the booster shot, as they're condemning ivermectin, as they're about to raise the prices of those two particular vaccines in EU as AstraZeneca falls out of favor in the EU. Mind you, AstraZeneca is also the one that's like, yeah, we're not going to make it for profit. So like, as all this stuff is going on, we're having this issue, and basically, I like kind of like, I don't say I put my foot down, but I was like, yo, like, I'm doing my job. Now if y'all can watch the video, decide if the facts are accurate, and then go on from there. But like, just because it makes somebody uncomfortable doesn't mean it shouldn't be said.
Yeah.
So we end up doing that one, and it ends up going viral on Twitter, and everybody is overwhelmingly supportive of it. And that's like, that was always my goal. Is there's a way you can have these conversations, and that people who may fall into one camp or the other can all watch and be like, okay, there's something not right here, regardless of where you fall. And that's definitely what I want to do with the platform on RT, similar to what I do on my show. But, where more millions of people can hear it.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on the move, and I'll be looking forward to checking that out for sure.
Appreciate it, man. Thank you.
It seems like RT, certainly when it comes to cable news, is the only place where you really are allowed to have conversations that are outside of the box. So
100%.
Yeah.
100%. Yeah. They literally, I told them whenever they first reached out to me, I'm like, y'all do know who I am, right? Like, yeah, we've been watching you for the last year and a half. I'm like, you do know the stuff I talk about, right?
Right.
Like, yeah, that's why we watched you. So yeah, that was exciting. Like, yeah, we hope you do it more. I was like, okay, whatever, let's go.
Yeah, cool. All right. Well, I am happy to have you on this show right before your big break. So, we can talk about things. And again, I wanted to have you on to kind of specifically have this conversation about race. And as I was as I was doing the research, watching your stuff, getting prepared for this, there's certainly a lot of other topics that we could talk about. So, let's see what we get to today. But we'll just get started with this kind of major central theme, since it's been such a big issue. It's out of the news right now, but it'll probably make its way back into the news cycle and be a huge issue again whenever the media gods decide, I guess, which is maybe something we could talk about too. Like, well, I guess I wanted to start, in the email that I sent you. I just kind of described my own experience, which was I had a grandmother who was born in 1900. She was born in Georgia. And the lady was definitely a racist, I mean, the whole family knows it. We all knew it. But my parents seemed like, they were probably they were a little bit older. They were in their 40s, I think, late 30s during the 1960s. And I think they were really heavily influenced by Martin Luther King. And from my experience, a lot of white people were. And it really tempered a lot of that sort of traditional racism that had happened, and there were a lot of changes that got made at that time. And so from my perspective, I mean, it just doesn't seem like I was necessarily raised that way, and we've always tried not to be racist. We've always known that it was an issue and a thing, but at the same time, it's not like I grew up in an African American community, or I had a lot of Black friends, or I really don't even know how to have this conversation necessarily. And right now, I think I also told you, I mean, I live here in Northern California. I think this community is 99% white. There may not be a whiter community in the country. So
yeah, unless you're in the Bay Area specifically, not like San Francisco Bay Area. I'm talking about the actual Bay Area.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was going to say. My Black friend moved to Oakland a few years ago. So,
yeah, that's good. My family out there lives in San Pablo, Oakland, Richmond, like that area.
Yeah. Yeah. So, which is understandable, I mean, he felt lonely out here. I think he certainly kind of stuck out. Right. And he'll tell me to my face, like, yeah, I needed to be around more of my people. Yeah. Right. I don't even know. Is that racist? Can I say it like that? I don't know.
No, people like being around others they can relate to, that they can build with.
Yeah.
Like, that like, it's like camaraderie and community, right? It's not necessarily that, it's not like because they're a particular race that he wants to be around them. It's just that there's a relatability factor, and there's a experiential connectivity that can't be replicated just by like these conversations of, oh, like I feel for you. I mean, I hear about what you go through. That's super sad. It's like, yeah, I mean, but like, you can't really, you haven't gone through it though. So there's some conversations that we have like as humans, where the starting off point of that particular conversation is based on a bunch of factors like experiences, personal background, understandings that you might have, like common knowledge that you might have, where if somebody came into that conversation halfway through, they're like, what the fuck? How do we get here?
Yeah.
But the people who have the same experiences or similar experiences, they start off their conversation there because there's that understanding of everything else without there having to be an explanation. And that's what everybody does. That's kind of how we end up in tribes, is
Yeah.
that there's an understood, sometimes it's great, sometimes it's a horrible thing. But it's like whenever I joke around a lot, whenever I see a rich white liberal somewhere out here in South Miami with the three signs like Biden, Harris, get vaxxed, and BLM,
Yeah.
all in the same sign. Like, I don't actually believe they think Black Lives Matter, first of all. I don't believe they know anything about healthcare. I don't think they've done any research in it. They're just quoting something they just have a nice little slogan out there. Do I actually think they know anything about Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, like their actual backgrounds? No. But with those three signs, that is a projection of status, right? They're letting you know everything about them without you actually having to have a conversation with them. And other liberals know that. Just like, to some degree, it's like that if you have a MAGA sign outside of your yard or something like that, maybe a MAGA and Ron DeSantis. I know the things I can talk to them about. I know the things that I probably have in common with them. I know things I may not have in common with them. So it's like that when you're talking about wanting to be around people who've had similar experiences. There's some conversations you can have that you don't have to go through explaining everything you've been through, so that you can finally start to have the conversation that you want to have.
Right. Well, why don't you tell us about some of your personal experiences with racism and how it affects, people of color around you in your community? Like, what is going on right now that you see that is affecting you on a daily basis, or is it just occasionally that you run into, some asshole that kind of gives you the look or says something? How does it affect you today in America right now? How has it affected you in your life growing up?
Man, so I'm mixed. I'm Barbadian and French actually, but I'm the darkest in my family,
Right.
which is weird. Like everybody else is light skinned. I just came out like this. Whatever, it's cool. But but I was very fortunate enough that when I was in high school, I grew up because I was in a military town. I grew up in a community actually that was primarily mixed. So everybody was mixed, and then but there was no one who was overtly racist. Like at all, be overtly. Now, what I later ended up finding out, unfortunately, was that there was still a lot of racism that I had suffered from that I was just completely oblivious to.
Okay.
Like, for example, I was in debate. I was one of the best debaters in the country at one point in high school, and not for nothing, but there was not a lot of Black debaters, and the ones who were there just weren't good. There's a lot of reasons for that. We don't have to get into that, but it's just, unfortunately, that's just the way it was, which is what made me kind of like an anomaly, but also a conundrum for people who had whatever idea that they had for their students or their kids when it came to using that debate platform to elevate their kids into a higher social status later on. Because like winning a tournament or several of them, winning a national tournament, even placing one of those things will damn near guarantee you a full ride to a lot of places when you're competing against other students who are usually the students that are competing for like the Rhodes Scholarship, and there's another one too. But basically, there's a lot of scholarships out there where it's like the best scholarships in the country. You're competing with people all over the country, sometimes all over the world. A lot of them are in that debate league. So it was a big deal. I didn't realize at the time that me winning so much was pissing coaches off, debate coaches off. And I was at a tournament where this is like basically everything kind of like came together for me at this point, like my senior year. So I had the whole thing figured out. And I had a round where I was in Student Congress. And Student Congress is the hardest debate event in forensics and debate because it's like 26 other people in the room that you're competing against at the exact same time. And you have a bunch of legislation that you have to decide whether or not you're going to write speeches on it. You have to get educated on all of it. You have to give speeches. It's a pretty hard debate event. And I was getting I had perfect scores on all my speeches. As far as like the way I conducted myself in chamber, I had first place across the board in the first half of the tournament. And there was a plot from the coaches and their students to closet me out of that round. And my debate coach was trying to figure out what was going on while I was dealing with it in chamber. And effectively, the tab room came in and said I cussed somebody out in the middle of their speech, which is weird. Like while they were speaking, I was like cussing at them, which wasn't true. And then they did a vote to whether or not to closet me. Of course, the chamber was like, no, he didn't do that. So the tab room overruled the vote and closeted me anyway. And getting closeted is such a big deal that it leads to a suspension in school. It's like the equivalent of getting a red card as a high school soccer player. You can get like a 2-day suspension in your school for getting a red card as a soccer player in school. So is that, and if you get suspended from school, you're kicked off of the debate team permanently. So that's what happened, effectively. Now, I had no idea what really happened. I knew it was clearly a competition thing. But basically, when I was about 23 or 24 years old, I had reconnected with my old debate coach, and I had been really upset with him actually up until this point, because I thought that he just let the whole thing happen, because he didn't want to tell me what had really happened, because he didn't want me to be in my head about it for the rest of my young adult life. Where basically the other coaches told him that they weren't going to let some little black boy be the best debater in the country. Yeah. And I found out that the assistant coaches on my team were racist, and that is why they didn't like me. Because we started our whole debate program because we were always good at the speaking side, so humorous interpretation, duos and all that good stuff. But our debate program was trash. And they launched the debate, basically the prominence of the debate program came because I was the one who got thrown into the fire, learned the process, and taught everybody else. And then we became one of the best debate programs in the country. And this is something that the assistant coaches had been trying to attempt to do for years before I even got there. So they took exception with that, right? And so that was something that I didn't even realize was happening to me at the time. Because I was kind of I'm like, no, because everything is about merit, right? Why would someone dislike you just because you're doing well in an event? I don't dislike them because they're doing well. I figure that just means I should compete harder because that's what everything is. It's a meritocracy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And it turned out that that wasn't the case at all. Fast forward, I even experienced that in college debate, and when people figured out how good of a debater I was then, because these are the people in college, the VP of McKinsey ended up, I debated against him. And he ended up becoming the VP of McKinsey 3 years later. Those type of people. Ted Cruz was an APTA. So same thing. We're not going to let some little black kid or older black kid be the best debater.
Right.
And there was a conspiracy to kick me out of the debate league before we started doing the placing for worlds, the world competition, and all that good stuff. And so, once again, I ended up figuring that out too. And so, that's just school stuff. I got jumped by 6 cops in a Burger King, not even, 2017, 2018. I got jumped by 6 cops. They were called on somebody else. I was the only black person. Oh, excuse me. No, it was me and my friend.
Right.
I was the only black person at the time that they could see in the establishment. So I'm on my phone waiting for my food. They run in, 6 of them, and are trying to beat the shit out of me and drag me to the ground. And the girls are screaming whoa, he didn't do anything. They're ignoring them. And these girls are hanging on these cops' neck, trying to pull them off me. The person that they did acknowledge, though, is my friend, who asked them, why do they keep pulling out their guns? Now, mind you, my friend's the only other black person in the room.
Right.
So they couldn't take me down. And I've been in the military, so I know combatives and all that good stuff. So, and I'm a bigger guy. I'm 6'1", 210, 215 pounds. So they couldn't really bring me down because it's Miami and all the cops 5 foot, 5'6". And they instead arrest my friend. So, and he's not from here. I'm like, shit, I can't let him go to jail by himself. He's not gonna know what the hell to do. So I go to the ground, or I'm about to let them just take me to the ground. So when I'm like, all right. I stopped struggling. They acted like they were done trying to fight me. When I stopped tensing up, they grabbed me and slammed me on my shoulder, dislocated my shoulder, tore my rotator cuff, and they weren't going to take me to the hospital. Instead, they were going to take me to jail and let me suffer. And the only reason they didn't is because I'm okay, So I don't know how you all think this is going to go, but you might want to Google my fucking name before you make this decision. So the supervisor Googles me, and then he's like, call the ambulance. And that's the only reason they took me. So then I get to the hospital, and they don't tell me what I'm being charged for. I tore my rotator's cuff. They had to like do like this procedure where they put it back in. I stay in the hospital for 2 days. And then on the last day, like 3 a.m, some cop comes in, a black cop, and like cuffs me to the bed. Now I'm like, oh, what is this for? And he's like, oh, it's because you're like under arrest. I'm like, well, haven't I been under arrest this entire time? I just went the fuck home. He's like, oh, no, you weren't under arrest this entire time. They didn't put an arrest affidavit in until like 2 hours ago. I said, then why were there cops sitting outside of my bed, like my hospital room? He said, well, they shouldn't have been sitting outside of your bed. We just got this arrest affidavit in. And I'm like, well, what does it say I did? So you were trespassing in a Burger King, okay? And that I was resisting arrest. Yeah. And I'm explaining to him what happened, and like that, because he was kind of confused too. He's like, because there were cops outside of the room. He's like, so why wasn't I handcuffed to the bed, and why is he just now getting an arrest affidavit? Because that's out of procedure. And he was like, well, you need to press charges on these cops because that's kidnapping. What they're doing actually is kidnapping, and they falsify an arrest affidavit to cover their ass for beating the shit out of me. Right. And then you look at the fucking police report, it like describes me as like some 6'5", 250-pound giant. And then my friend, after I get out of jail, tells me that they're bragging about taking me down. Like he could hear them bragging when he was in the patrol car about taking me down, like I was a trophy. I go to sue them. No one wants to sue the Miami PD because they hire all of the fucking law firms in the state, put them on retainer, so there's a conflict of interest for them to sue them. Yeah. So that's just a few stories.
Yeah, man. I mean, I'm sorry to hear that, you know. It's interesting that the race thing comes up as if you're successful in the white community. I mean, the story about the debate, it seems like that's when those feelings kind of start to come out. Like it's not going to be overt in your face. But then it seems like if other white people start to feel a little bit threatened, if you're being a little bit too successful in that space, that's when you're feeling it. And then I think the police story, that's, from my understanding, is pretty common in the African American community, right? I mean, this police issue is huge.
Yeah, it is. It is. And don't get me wrong, people. Like I fully acknowledge, like in a place like West Virginia where there's only poor people, like of course, police are going to go after the poor people. It's just unfortunately true that in most metropolitan areas, or even in some rural areas, the poorest people are still the black people because of redlining and things like that.
Right.
So, and there's there's a reason for that. And I would say and I would like to get your opinion on this. So when it comes to the perceived success of black people, in the way some white people, and unfortunately the truth is, in my experience, is actually white liberals that this has been more prominent with.
Right.
There is this idea that the country is in fact a meritocracy. That if you do, well, maybe not as much anymore because the last couple of years I feel like has killed that illusion. But for the most part, people have believed that this is a meritocracy. People have believed that if you do, especially if you're raised in a white community, if you do the right thing, you work harder, you work smarter, you come to work, you put your hard hat on, you just get the job done, then you will be rewarded. And so all of your success comes from maybe at the most the influence of your family, but mostly you and what you have done to deserve it. No one wants to really believe that they had an advantage over somebody else for whatever reason that may be. Mm-hmm. But like at the end of the day, it's just the truth, right? Like just like I was talking about redlining, people associate, like a lot of leftists associate FDR like this fucking savior. FDR is like the worst thing that happened in the black community in the last 100 years. He's the one who introduced redlining.
Yeah.
He shut down the black banks were the only banks that survived the Great Depression. A lot of people don't know that. And he shut them down anyway so that they couldn't surpass JP Morgan. So they couldn't surpass Wells Fargo and Bank of America and all these major banks, so that they couldn't compete with the Fed in the national budget that was being established at that time. It had just gotten established, and the bank that's would have been on Wall Street that was burned to the ground and there's no record of anymore would have actually been able to compete with the Fed. He was not going to allow that to happen. So they redline us, and then they disallow us from getting mortgages. They stop us from getting business loans. They, you know how the story goes. Like 93% of all education is paid for through property taxes. Number one reason people get divorced is because of finances. So now finances is becoming more and more of an issue within the Black community, which obviously makes them ripe for crime. And so, and of course, this was not treatment that was given to the white communities. Right. They have poor white communities have different issues, but it wasn't because they were white that they were being targeted. That's a totally separate issue. These communities were specifically being targeted because they were Black. So there was somebody somewhere, right, where two people went for a business loan in the same area. The Black person was immediately denied because of the neighborhood that they lived in, whereas this white person got this business loan, got a low interest rate, and became successful.
Right.
How is that a free market? That person had an advantage. They did work hard. No one's saying they didn't deserve the opportunity. But in a meritocracy, both people will have the same opportunity to achieve the same level of success, all things being equal. But the problem is all things weren't equal. And some people have to accept now, not only was their success potentially aided by the lack of opportunity someone else got, but also that means you failed even though you may have gotten more opportunity than somebody else got, in spite of all the circumstances that this Black person might have went through. If you see them succeed, that was in spite of that opportunity that they didn't have. And so now that person may have to deal with, well, shit, I have to now look, they scapegoat the Black person or scapegoat the system and say, oh, it's because they got affirmative action and got all this shit. I promise you, affirmative action doesn't help as much as you would think it is. And actually mostly helps white women, believe it or not. They're the number one beneficiaries of affirmative action. Okay. But they don't, so a lot of people will have to wrestle with that within themselves. And that's hard to do, man. It's hard to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I did an interview, it's been probably a year or two now. And it was with another white guy about racism, so it wasn't going to be quite as the quality as this conversation. But he wrote a book about the redlining thing, and I learned a lot about it, and I have been amazed at how few people discuss that, because that is something that I have experienced as a white guy, where I see, in my own family or in other families where white people are struggling just like everybody else, right? And we got, I don't like for a person like me, I didn't want to get that corporate job. And so I didn't get maybe some of that white privilege if I had joined the corporate world. Like, I kind of learned early on that I didn't want to really have much to do with that. and right.
Understandably so.
And I've been just, doing my own thing, making it on my own. And so I guess when that concept of white privilege kind of started coming up, at first I was like, I struggle too, just like everybody else. I don't know why we have to turn it into this race thing necessarily. Mm-hmm. But as I started thinking about it more and more, the redlining thing really made a lot of sense to me, because again, just to finish that story, I do have friends that, they're struggling just like everybody else. And they're in their 40s or 50s or whatever, and then their parents pass away, and they sell the parents' house for $1 million, and they get that generational wealth. And I was actually, looking to do research for this show. I heard you talking about FDR and the Federal Housing Authority. I remember that interview that I did, and I was really happy that you've picked up on that, because nobody talks about this. It's like when people talk about reparations, they're talking about slavery and going all the way back through this past history. And then I think white people have a tendency to be like, well, I didn't own a slave. Yeah. And it seems like something that was so long ago.
That. And you can make an argument for that, but that, in my opinion, slavery had little to nothing to do, at least in a, more in a direct way. Like, it had little to nothing to do with white privilege of today necessarily. Yeah. There is like a lead up to it. You can make where you can make a loose connection, but the redlining thing is direct, right? Because
Totally.
business loans are more of a factor, like mortgages. Like there are people who are like a year or a generation removed, a parent or a grandparent removed from not being able to get a second mortgage or a mortgage on their home, which is the number one way that people finance small businesses that aren't going to be able to sell their house or inherit a home so they don't have to pay anything but property taxes so they can buy that second car. They don't have to deal with the urban credit score that Black people have to deal with. This is like today that this is happening.
Right.
So I agree. Like that's why people, like some white people, will tune out completely.
Yeah. But
go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say this redlining thing makes so much more sense when you realize it, because then it puts the plight of the African American community and then even the idea of white privilege, I think, in a little bit of a more modern time scale. And it's really understandable because, like I said, like I have friends that clearly cashed in. I had, a relative that bought a house in Stanford, in Palo Alto, and in 1955 for $15,000 or something, and it's worth $1.5 million today. I mean, yeah, it's just like, and those are the properties that African Americans were not allowed to get in the 50s. They were redlined out of them. And then
our homes and then because we couldn't get small business loans and mortgage loans and things like that, when everyone else was, benefiting from economic upturns, guess what then happens? Corporations can then come in and gentrify the areas.
Right.
Because our property is worth less for no other reason than the government interfering. And then the gentrification happens. And then the areas that no one wanted to live in all of a sudden become the hot spots after Black people and sometimes Latinos. And like they build up that metropolitan area for people to like it. And then it's always in a very convenient area because they couldn't afford vehicles. So they were living in areas that were convenient and nobody wanted to be there. And so then they get built up by that community, and then that community then gets pushed out because of something that happened literally 100 years ago. And I would say this too as well. So when there's a conversation about white privilege, a lot of the times it ends up being centered around money, at least from the perspective of white people, whenever they're trying to deny the idea of a privilege, or at least their personal privilege. But what is oftentimes not understood is to immediately think that people are talking about money when we're speaking about white privilege is literally the privilege.
Right.
Because for the most part, I feel like I'm a pretty well-spoken guy. I graduated from one of the best schools in the country. I'm a military vet. I've worked for presidential candidates. I've been on television. And yet none of that mattered whenever the cops walked in and beat the shit out of me and kidnapped me in that Burger King.
Yeah.
I get crippling anxiety whenever a cop is behind me.
It's bad enough for me.
I could be doing absolutely nothing wrong. Doesn't matter.
Right.
Like I have to worry whenever I'm interacting with somebody on a professional level. If it's the first time that I've met them, I have to worry about what kind of Black they perceive me as. And is that going to be a factor in how we engage from here on? Or are they going to ignore that? Or are they going to just take me as I am and as a person? Those are things that we have to think about when applying for jobs, when interacting with cops, when interacting with the average person in a relationship. One of the relationships that I had in high school, I had to end, not because me and my girlfriend didn't work out. It's because her dad was racist as shit and threatened to put her up for adoption if she did not break up with me.
Wow, yeah.
And we were both mixed kids, but I was Black. You know what I'm saying? Like, yeah, we're mixed. My brother looks mixed. My sisters look mixed, but I'm Black. You know what I'm saying? And so the race, when we're talking about it, a lot of people always say everything is racist. And I don't like when people do that because some people do overuse the shit out of it. However, race isn't this arbitrary thing like, oh, well, I'm half white. Like, yeah, am I half white? Technically speaking, yes. But race is what happens if I walk into my girlfriend's or potential girlfriend's parents' home. Let's just say they're from Alabama or Georgia. What does her dad say when I walk into the room? That's the race I am.
Yeah.
I mean, because it's circumstances, it's the way people react to you viscerally that is outside of your control.
Right. Just because of the color of your skin.
hmm
Yeah.
And the way that they've been conditioned to react, even in places like what you said. You said you have barely even seen a black person. One of my brothers now best friends, he's from Alabama, part of the Harrison family, which is like one of the third richest family in the entire Confederacy. This man had never seen a black person ever in his life. My brother
Wow.
was the first one, and because he joined the Navy, and he would say some shit. Obviously, that wasn't cool. And it's when my brother remembered that he had never seen a black person, instead of scolding him, he was like, "Hey, real quick, bro, can we talk?" No, you can't
Right.
say that. You shouldn't say that. He was like, "Well, why not? I was just joking." He's like, "Yeah, but this is what this actually means, and this is why people are." And then the dude was like, "What? For real? Well, shit, I ain't talk to my family about this. This is fucked up, you know."
Yeah.
And because my brother was patient enough to understand, like, he's subject to the same propaganda that we're subject to, right? And that you're subject. If you're a Democrat, you're subject to the same propaganda Republicans are subject to. That's the only reason that y'all hate each other so much, because you would realize that we actually have more in common than we have differences. Especially poor people in the working class. Like right now, we're finding out that
Right.
all the working class is getting fucked right now. It don't matter who you voted for in 2016 or 2020. So that dude ended up basically disowning his family, because when they came to visit him when he graduated basic training, he was sitting with my brother, and they said, if you ever bring that N word around our family again, like we're not gonna, like we're just gonna disown you. And
Huh.
he was like, you know what? That's fine. You'll never see us again, and you'll never see your grandchildren again. That's fine. Bye. So he was willing, once somebody sat down and was understanding and explaining to him, you know, this is why this is wrong. This is why this is what we are actually like. He got to have a one-on-one conversation, got some experiential learning, and it literally made him conscious enough to realize how fucked up his family was. And and to be clear about that, that's got to be one of the, like, because it's not like you're just asking somebody to stop being racist. What you're asking someone to do, and people don't think about think about it on a human level. Stop talking to your grandmother. Your grandmother was actually a piece of shit. Your grandparents are actually a piece of shit. Your father is full of shit. Your best friend, your mentor, everybody in your neighborhood, everything that you have ever known to be true up until this point is bullshit. And so remove yourself from all of that. That is extremely difficult to ask for somebody to do, to the point where people will pretend to be racist just so they don't have to do it.
Right.
Because nobody would want to do it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I have a similar, like the military actually seems to be kind of a melting pot for people, because once they get together and they actually start talking to each other, like you say, I think we got more in common than we do these differences. And it's just because you haven't been exposed and you just have these predispositions. And the only way to get through it is to actually get to know each other and have conversations. Because I have a kind of a similar story. Like I said, my grandmother was racist, and I had cousins that were in Vietnam, right? And in Vietnam, like they're fighting side by side with African Americans. They don't give a shit about the color of somebody's skin,
Yeah.
right?
And they shooting at us. They don't care what race we are when they shoot back.
Yeah, exactly. They learned how to respect one another, and I guess they had I think it was a colonel. This was before my time, but I hear the story, and he was a colonel in the army, and they invited him over to the family dinner, right? Because they respected this guy, African American guy, and my grandmother had such a hard time having him around. But they were literally, I mean, they did it to show her, like, hey, this behavior can't really be tolerated anymore. And so it was one of the stories that we have in my family about like getting over it, learning a little bit more about, dealing with people, having respect for people from different cultural backgrounds and different skin tones and whatnot, and kind of healing from that, which is something that I think, we're all still doing. I mean, I'm open-minded to it. Like, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to have the conversation with you, to be like, and this actually, like, we can lead this one in because you told the story about the police too. And from my point of view, just, as a white person who's kind of looking in on the situation, it seems like, you have the redlining issue. And then I think the other serious issue for the African-American community is the drug war. I mean, right? This is their
all
excuse.
tied in together.
Yeah. I mean, we have Nixon on tape saying, like, well, let's make heroin illegal, flood the African-American community with heroin, and then we have an excuse to go in and arrest all these Black Panthers, right? I mean, this was their plan in the late 60s.
There was a former police chief. He was in LA, and they got him on camera admitting that the government was actively flooding the community with guns and heroin, and like that's one of the reasons he quit the force.
Right. Well, and it's funny because again, just since this whole white privilege conversation has happened, and then I'm thinking to myself, like, I mean, for one thing, I'm not exposed to, a lot of the Black community living here, and but I'm trying to kind of look back at myself and ask myself, do I have some, some subconscious racism that I don't understand about myself?
We all have it.
Well,
even Black people.
Yeah, and that's a good point too. Actually, that's a cool.
We're conditioned to, like,
Right.
Hollywood conditioned us to, right?
Well, and it's also kind of like, I think what you were talking about earlier. We all have our own communities too. I mean, if you're raised in the African American community, you're African American. It's totally normal to like feel comfortable in that environment and less comfortable when you go into a situation where there's going to be 99% white people, right? And then the opposite is going to be the case. Like it's also sort of normal to like be a little bit frightened or a little bit confused.
I'm like that. So I'm gonna give you an example. So
Cool.
Growing up, because I grew up mixed, and most of the people I knew actually were mixed. Like all my best friends are half something and half something. The first few times as an adult, I didn't really care when I was a kid because you just don't think about stuff like that. You're like, oh, I'm not. It's not weird to be in a room with a bunch of one group of people.
Yeah.
It was when I got older, I was more cognizant of like what that actually means as far as experiences are concerned. I would be in a room like, yeah, if it's all white people, yeah, slightly uncomfortable.
Right.
I would be in a room with even all Black people and be uncomfortable because I knew that they knew I wasn't necessarily the same kind of Black they were.
Interesting. Yeah.
Right. And I'm also, because I'm Bayesian. So like West Indians, we have our own thing that we have to deal with as diaspora. And so and that's a thing within the Black community. Like the ones who have been here, or that they call themselves American descendants of slaves, like for generations, they're the ones with the family reunions. Okay. Those ones, they don't look at us the same way as they look at each other.
Huh.
And that's a thing that nobody,
Sure.
unless you're in the Black community, would know about. But that's because there is a preconceived notion of what we see them as and vice versa. And then there's the actual Africans who hate they don't hate all of us, but they basically look down on us because they see us as we're we're the trash. Like they're corrupted. The white people have gotten them, they're westernized. They don't believe in the old culture, et cetera, et cetera. So they even look at us differently. And when they come here, they would actually rather be around like either Arabs or Desis and sometimes white people than they would feel comfortable being around all Black people who are born and raised here. So this is because we all have preconceived notions about what the other is.
Yeah.
And then people do it. I'm sure that part of it is like almost a defense mechanism so that you can quickly weigh and assess situations, like as human nature. But at the same time, there is an understanding that is how human nature is, and the powers that be, in order to divide, they use that to their advantage, which is why you see people casted exclusively in certain roles, and then that's all they ever are allowed to play, and how Black people are portrayed, and how Asian women are always portrayed as what's the word I'm looking for, subservient, right? Mm-hmm. And then all the Asian guys are only casted. The only time they're in leading roles if they're in a karate movie. And every white guy is a sociopathic CEO somewhere. And then like Black guys can only be sidekicks if they are in a movie. And then like even my friend was joking the other day. We're big Marvel fans. And I was joking saying that because they were going to make the new or they're thinking about making Reed Richards Black in the new Fantastic Four, because in the comics, King the Conqueror, who is his descendant, is actually Black. So they're trying to be accurate. And he was saying that I was saying that Susan Storm, it would be cool if Susan Storm and Johnny were Latino. And he was like, oh, word? So you're going to make another Latino fire character, I guess. And I was like, I was like, oh my God.
Is that a thing? Yeah.
You're fucking right. They do that all the time. I'm like, she's like, yeah, they're always associated with Diablo and fire. And I was like, damn, that's crazy. I didn't even think about that.
Right.
But it's a thing because we all have our preconceived notions about what category people fit in. I'll give you another example. I used to play, I still play, but in high school, I was one of the best players in my state in basketball. Like it's North Carolina. Like if you know anything about North Carolina, there's UNC and Duke there. Steph Curry's from there, and Michael Jordan's from there, Vince Carter's from there. You can go down the list. So this is like what we do. If I would go to a gym or a court where nobody knew who I was, I would almost get picked up last, or I would have to wait until I like called next and then pick my team, because people just assumed that I wasn't good because they couldn't pinpoint what my experiences were as a black person. So I would have to go on the court, bust their ass over and over again, and they'd be like, oh shit, he's actually good. Now, I also played soccer, and I was really good at that too. I would always get picked first, every single time. And I'm like, what the how do y'all even know I'm good? No, I've never even seen half y'all people before. They just assumed that I was good because they were thinking either, one, if you're black and you play soccer, you're probably exceptionally good at it, or else you wouldn't be playing it. But two, so because I'm Barbadian and I have unique features, because Barbadians are unique, because so in the West Indies, it's mostly Indians, Hindu faith. Now, Barbados is different because it's people who migrated from Bangladesh to escape persecution from Hindus. And so they're the only island in the West Indies that's primarily they're descendant of Muslim Bengalis. And then they came to the States, but when they came, like most of the West Indians, they went to Jamaica, Queens, and New York, but couldn't tell people, or at least not make a big deal out of being from Barbados, because people would associate that with being from Bangladesh and not being Hindu, and they didn't want to be persecuted. So they overtly assimilated to the point where most people from Barbados have no association with the culture whatsoever. But we all have very unique features. Like our eyelashes are different. A lot of us have like freckles. We're a little bit more reddish brown instead of like being brown, like a traditional brown, like a mixed person would be. Like our eye structure is different. It's just our hair texture is even different. Right. Almost every black superstar from the 90s and early 2000s was actually Barbadian. LL Cool J, Megan Good, Cuba Gooding Jr., his brother, Will Smith, DJ Grandmaster Flash, A$AP Rocky, Rihanna. I mean, the list goes on.
No kidding.
I swear. And it's because people in Hollywood figured out that we have features that are quote unquote soft enough that is acceptable by white pop culture, but we're still black enough to be casted in leading roles in black movies and hip hop music and R&B.
Right.
And so that is how visceral our reactions are to race, and even the subtleties and nuances of what we think a race should look like or shouldn't look like.
Well, it's so interesting because like what you're describing is really almost really individual, and that's true, right? I mean, every person is different, and everybody's got really a different racial background. There's actually all kinds of subtleties of combinations. It's not like, you know, you're Chinese and you're black and, you know, you're Native American and I'm white. We're all sort of some kind of combination thereof, but these subtle differences then affect our experience in the world.
And yeah, because it's, I mean, I'll give you another example. Like, so Brazil, everybody considers Brazilian women like the most exotically beautiful women on the planet. Like everybody, like it's almost like unanimous consent at this point. Part of the reason why is because the Ottoman Empire and the Portuguese Empire used to go at it all the time. And so a lot of Portuguese people have Arabic, they're mixed with Arabic. A lot of them, I would say even the majority of them are at this point. They come to Brazil and they mix with the indigenous and black people, now, and the African slaves that were there. But what people don't realize is that we already understand, for various reasons, that it is actually considered to be taboo in both Western culture and in Arab culture for black people to end up with Arabs and have kids because of the Muslim-Christian connection, because of, unfortunately, Arabs' perception of black people, how they like to kind of keep everything in their family and their culture and their community and marry within their religion. So we never see it. The only time that we see it in Marseille is in Brazil, where there's neither a huge Christian population or at least no stigma against a Christian population dating an Arab, because they have no idea what the fuck that's about. They're just like, oh, I was here and these are the people that were available to date. And so we had kids. Like this is, they don't think about it. They just did it. And so this is like the only time that we see a country have a massive population of Arabs and black people and Arabs and indigenous people mixing. So they have curly hair, maybe my skin complexion or lighter, but then they'll have green eyes, which doesn't happen anywhere else in the world.
Right.
But that's why everybody's so infatuated with them, because it's something we never see anywhere else.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, and it is. I mean, probably part of the root of the problem is like I know. I mean, at least especially the English were just extremely racist, and when they're colonized, they didn't tend to mix in the way that even other European cultures would in South America, around the world, and you end up with these more these combinations of different races and these different kinds of expressions of race in different places around the world, where especially the English, I think, really had the superiority complex, and where they colonized, they
I'm like, y'all the same people where all of your kings and queens died of the exact same throat cancer. Like, are you kidding me?
And I'm Irish, by the way, so no love for the English on that one. Just to let you know.
Yeah, we call y'all the black people of UK, bro. That's what we call.
Right on. Right on.
Like, bro, every time I'm like, yo, the Irish went through it. God damn.
Yeah. Yeah. Although I've been accused of being racist when I bring that up, when I'm like, hey, my people were persecuted too back in the day. I mean, the English tried to eradicate us, and
it's a very valid, and it was a version of racism, because like y'all have, especially back then, like closer to like, people who before there was a lot of mixing, like y'all have very, very unique features compared to the people on, in England, like in mainland, like, because like basically Ireland, you're not an island, are you? Or are y'all island?
Yeah, it's an island.
Yeah. So even though it isn't discussed like that, but because of y'all being islanders, y'all have very, very unique features and unique accent. And my guess is a lot of resources too that mainland England wanted access to.
Oh yeah.
Even though, of course, y'all wanted to, not give them that. And so there is some similarities there. I think that some people react like that because they feel like it is almost a dismissal of the uniqueness of the experience of a Black person, depending on what the context is. And so I think that's where, so it's like when it's brought up, more so that the fact that it's brought up. You know what I'm saying? And because I think that more people need to know that. Not a lot of people know what the hell the Irish went through. Not a lot of people know. And
they call it the potato famine.
European imperialism and colonialism, that Irish story is a very important story to learn about.
Yeah, I think so too. And it kind of goes to the point of, at least, we do have a lot more in common than we have these differences. You are listening to this. You are listening to the first free hour of The Shift with Doug McKenty. For access to the full feature-length versions of the podcast, go to www.theshiftnow.com and subscribe for the audio version for just $6 a month. Access the full-length episodes in video form through rockfin.com by subscribing at the Shift with Doug McKenty landing page. For $9.99 a month, you gain access not only to The Shift, but also all other premium content material hosted on the platform. Find out more at www.theshiftnow.com/store. Detoxify your body, decolonize your mind, make the shift. Yeah, I don't want to keep you too long, but I do have one more question that I want to get to while I have you here, and then we can kind of wrap it up whenever you need to go. But just to kind of finish up with this idea of race and what's going on, because I've always had one big question, and I want to see what you think about it. I mean, I guess it was sort of, from my understanding, the central difference between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, where Martin Luther King was kind of desiring, I don't want to say assimilation of African Americans into normal American society, but he saw sort of this cooperative, everybody working together, where Malcolm X was more like, African Americans,
meritocracy, desegregation, integration. Yeah.
Right. But then how is that, when you compare it to, say, Malcolm X, who was more like African Americans, we have our own culture, we have our own views, we could, just create our own communities and work out, work our problems through by ourselves, be basically a separate thing, and not care about what the white community or white culture is doing. And sometimes I think that a lot of these, again, like the virtue signaling liberals that you've talked about, when they're talking about diversity, I kind of hear them talking about assimilation, right? I mean, somewhere back there, it's like, and to me, there's a white supremacy in that. Like, our culture is superior.
There's a shitload of white supremacy.
We want to assimilate you because we're so good. We want to assimilate people of color into our culture, which is clearly superior. I mean, they don't say it that way, but that's what they're talking about.
They accept the Kamalas, they accept the Cory Bookers, they accept the Obamas, they accept the ones who speak like them, who act like them, who will
Right.
play the game like them. But like somebody like myself or Ice Cube or maybe Lamar Jackson from the Ravens who refused to take the vaccine. And they immediately try to demonize him. Immediately. Granted, when you're that famous, sometimes shit don't work because you
Yeah.
make a lot of money for a lot of people, and people all of a sudden forget what they don't like about you. But like, you see that when there are people who don't assimilate, that love that we would get, like when I was a Bernie supporter exclusively, the love I got from white leftists was like, "Ooh, I could do no wrong,"
Yeah.
right? But the moment that I questioned their white savior, it was an issue. But I'm like, well, hold on. I liked Bernie because of all these issues, and I also was against corruption in the establishment. So if he's behaving in a way that's antithetical to the message that I started liking him for, and is behaving like the establishment, like logic would tell you that of course I'm going to criticize him. That was my perspective, but I didn't really understand people the way I do now, where I'm like, oh, because y'all don't give a shit about these issues, really. It's this is all like the BLM vaccinated. It's like the signs outside of the fucking apartments and on the outside the houses on their lawns. It's virtue signaling for to build clicks, to build these little tribes that you can then turn into a podcast, that you can then turn into a nonprofit organization, that y'all have this understanding of what's acceptable, the acceptable parameters of discussion to have. Yeah, you can be anti-establishment until it's time to vote fucking Democrat, because that's what you better do, because that's where our money comes from. You see it amongst Republicans. You can be anti-establishment, but you better not speak out against the war on terror. You better not support universal health care, because that's where we draw the line. So they try to set these limited hangouts or limited parameters of discussion and debate. And if you delve outside of that, like I'm not a fan. I kind of despise Tamala Loren, but there was a point where she spoke up and said that her boss's stance on abortion laws was completely and totally wrong, and they fired her for it because you're supposed to be our little blonde girl who says exactly what we tell her to, and just be cute and shut up and do what we tell you to do.
Right.
The moment she stepped outside of that, and she spoke from her identity, which no matter how much you sell out, there's always that one moment, that visceral moment where you can't help but like I just can't, like, yeah, there's limits to the shit. And she had that moment. Candace Owens has had that moment when talking about prison reform, right? Even I would say Trump has had that moment when it comes to I'm sure he saw a lot, and because he used to hang out with the rap community and the black community and hip hop community and the black, like he was really big in the black community, like in the 90s. All the rappers used to talk about hanging out with him. So I'm sure that there were a lot of points, like when it came to the First Step Act, he remembered all those conversations that he had. He remembered all the things that his friends like Mike Tyson and others had talked about, and he was like, I got to do something if I can. Does he get it right all the time, or even most of the time? No. But there's just always that point where if you have any piece of a soul left, your identity will come out, and the experiences that you've had or your friends or your family have had start to guide your conversation. And if you step outside of that left-right paradigm or the acceptable parameter of the conversation, you will be ostracized. We have not seen Tamala Loren since, and nobody realizes it.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. So you feel like if you really take a stand, like for a separate African American culture, or for a separate cultural identity, then you get outside that box, and you're not allowed into that accepted parameters of those conversations that you're allowed to have in typical politics today within the left-right paradigm.
Yep. Whenever I remember Ice Cube came out and said, guys, I've been doing some research, and I realized both parties are full of shit, and they've never helped the black community. So I don't think that we should vote for anybody until somebody gives us a promise. And so what did they say? They attacked him and said that he was a Trump supporter.
Yeah.
So it's like, no, that's not what I said. I said that neither of the party. And in fact, I called Joe Biden to see if he would work with me. And they were like, nah, we'll talk to you after we win.
Right.
And they're like, oh, so you're a Trump supporter. He said, no, that's not what I said. But they are trying to push him into one tribe or the other, because they if you push them into that one tribe, then they're hoping that all the black people would not listen to anything that he had to say. And they do that, of course, with some populist conservatives too, that they push you and make you look like a dirty, rotten communist. And that word is warped like a motherfucker too. But that's a different conversation for a different day.
Yeah.
Like because I'm not a communist. I don't actually like Marx. Marx was actually a racist, and I think that he was actually an asset. But that's a whole different thing.
Yeah, right.
But,
we can talk about that.
yeah, yeah, he's an asset. So is George Orwell, by the way. So anyway, but they'll try to call you a communist because that's a virtue signal to not allow conservatives to hear what you have to say, and potentially change hearts and minds. The one thing they don't like people who point out their ideological inconsistencies, because then they start to see like, hold on, well, not only are we more alike as working class and poor people than we thought, but y'all motherfuckers is a lot more alike than we thought too. And you've been pretending this entire time that you weren't, but you actually are. And the only reason you thought you liked that other group was because a lot of people thought that group was different than the other group. And it turns out that they're not.
Right.
So they don't want people to figure that part out. Even though at this point, like we got Democrat House, Democrat Senate, Democrat executive branch, mostly Democratic governors now. How's that working out for us?
Yeah.
The same way it did when well, Trump had all three branches of government, and then the Democrats used that as an excuse for why they couldn't get anything done. Then they win the House back, still don't get anything done under the excuse that, oh, well, it's a split government. Well, now you have everything back by hook or by crook. You somehow, every time conversations get brought up by the Senate, it's always Joe Manchin's fault that shit doesn't get done. But Chuck Schumer's name, who's the fucking Senate Majority Leader, never gets discussed. He's out here tweeting, give out $2,000 now. Just introduce the bill. You can do it. Or whenever the moratorium, the Trump's eviction, and it is Trump's eviction moratorium that he did because Congress refused to act. When it expired, the Supreme Court was like, well, no, we're overturning the extension because this is Congress's job. And Nancy Pelosi is like, y'all are cruel. And I'm like, no, they're like, no, you can do this right now. If you did this right now, the moratorium can extend as long as you want. But that means Supreme Court. Too bad we can't do anything about it, guys. Yeah. Sorry.
Nah, that was all part of the plan, right? I mean, and I even think that this cycle, it's like it's an 8-year cycle, really, where the people get sick of it, vote for one party, they control all three branches, and then for some reason they can't get anything done, and then the people are sick of it, and so that party loses the House 2 years later, or the Senate, and then it's a split government, and then they can't get anything done. And what they're really doing is, they're working for the corporations, they're not working for the people, and they're getting that job done, aren't they?
Yeah, and I would say now there is one positive that we can take away from this, which is that they have been able to get away with that for a long time in the past, because we weren't in this age of information that we're in now. They accidentally, the pandemic, at this point, I feel like you can make the argument that the way it was handled it was purposely mishandled to screw over as many people as possible so that companies like Blackwater and, and the federal government can come in and scoop up all the shit like they did in 2008, but even, I would say, probably 10 times that now.
Yep.
A lot of people who were screwed in 2008 never recovered. Instead of the 10 million people that were homeless in 2008 is going to be 28 million this time. So, but they did it. It was mishandled on purpose. But because of that, everybody had nothing to do but sit down and consume all this information and watch their neighbors that they thought they didn't like or disagreed with, their friends, their family get royally fucked in broad daylight. And then, Biden comes in, and some people believed in the left-right paradigm still. Biden's going to come in and save the day, right? The only thing things weren't getting done is because the Republicans were in, right?
Yeah.
So then what happens? Now they're like, oh, this motherfucker is doing worse shit. So now they're like, oh, well, shit, since I ain't have anything to do for the last year and a half, but watch y'all motherfuckers play patty cake with the U.S. economy, I saw all that shit. So now you got people like in New York, left, right, conservative, Democrat, whatever. They voted for Trump. They voted for Biden. They're tens. There's like thousands of people in New York marching against these mandates. Thousands of people. The media is not covering it.
Yeah.
But that only happens because the elite, they're smart. They're only smart when it comes to us having a lack of information to properly counter their narratives or be able to see the inconsistencies. Now that we can see the inconsistencies, they've never had practice in hiding inconsistencies because they've never had to.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, I've heard you talk about that. Like having that consistent worldview. That's what separates critical thinkers from what I've seen in the last year and a half, especially, is how the media uses the left-right paradigm to almost spoon feed what people think. And if they don't have that discipline to make sure that they're consistent in their thinking, it's like they just fall for it. They identify as left, and then the news tells them think like this, and they go, this is how I think because I'm left wing. And or if they identify as conservative and Fox News tells them to think like this, and it's so powerful, but I think that's why, like, we do actually come from different foundations, probably. Like I said, I'm more libertarian, you're more progressive in that way, but just I think having that consistent worldview is what can bring us together on the racial issue too. We can have these political and racial conversations and actually, like, okay, let's figure out how to maintain consistency here. Let's apply some critical thinking and we'll figure it out, right?
Yeah. And that's what I like. If I'm debating somebody, a lot of people, when they debate me, and this is just like a natural thing, they're debating like topics, they're debating an issue. I'm debating consistency or lack thereof, and that's it. That's why I never lose. Yeah. Because my consistency is like, there's like literally something in my brain that I cannot be paying attention to what the person on the debate screen is saying like 30 minutes in, because a lot of times they've already kind of low-key conceded that their defeat and they just start rambling the same shit over and over again. But when I hear something that directly contradicts something they had just said earlier in the conversation, there is like a red alarm that goes, I'm like, no. That's not what you just said earlier. Because if this is true and this is true, which is what you said, correct? Yes, what I thought. Then this is true, which means this has to be true. And usually if you've seen any of my debates, by the time I get to, and if you said this, then they snap and try to cut me off because they know if the conclusion that I'm getting to is 100% correct. And the only thing I did to prove it was just use what they said earlier. Like, that's it. Yeah. And people, and so that's how you know when somebody's debating to be right versus trying to figure out what's right. And I'm not debating to be right. I'm debating to figure out the correct answer. Yeah, and the only way we can figure that out is through consistency. And if we can't even agree on consistency or a consistent application of principles and facts, then like, how the fuck can we agree on how to solve problems? Yeah, exactly. We can't even agree on what the problems are. Yeah, I think that discipline is so important. It's so, it's just refreshing to hear you talk about it like that, because, again, the last year and a half, and with the left-right paradigm and all of these other things, I'm seeing a lot of psychological control at work that's really tapping into people's emotions, right? Or their identity in the left-right paradigm or whatever it is, or their race, right? And the system, the colonizers, or however you want to describe it, the people that have the money to pay for all of this propaganda that we get inundated with all the time, they know exactly how to target those emotional parts of ourselves, that psychological part. That if you don't have consistency, if you don't have that discipline to remain consistent, then you're going to get sucked into, all of a sudden you're going to be so far out in left field and they're going to be pulling your chain all day long. And that's what's happening right now. That's what's going on right now. The good thing is, though, which they don't account for because they only think in short-sighted terms, is that like anyone who is a human and has lived more than 20 years of their lives know, like, bro, people get exhausted of being like emotionally reacting all the time. They just, whether it's in relationships, friendships, life, you're like, you just fucking get exhausted. You're like, bro, this is tiring. Okay. Like, that's when you kind of like get over, you go back to your girlfriend or boyfriend, like, I was tripping. You know what? No, I'm taking time. I'm too tired of being mad. You need to fix the shit. Like, what do we gotta do that? That's what we need to figure out. And that's kind of like, now people are getting past the emotions of like, oh, everybody's dying, everybody. It's like, bro, people can't be paranoid forever. They just we don't have the capacity to, bro. We have the ADHD, my generation, we're the ADHD generation. Right. We can't even remember what the fuck we was mad about yesterday. And like, so now it's people just get exhausted of being upset all the time. They get exhausted of being fearful all the time. And that moment where they finally like, oh, I'm kind of tired. Is there any like way out of this? That moment, that brief moment where they had to think and be like, well, what's next? And they start looking for what's next. If they hear the right thing from the right person at the right time, that's when they wake up and they're a little bit more open and want to listen. And as far as the consistent application of like principles and how important it is, this will be the last thing I talk about. I do got to go, but it's a really good story. So I've had the theory about Antifa and Proud Boys being of the same ilk, if you will. They're from the same entity. And I didn't talk about it when I first had the theory in 2017, 2018, because that shit seems so far-fetched for the average person because of just how emotional people were. Yeah. But I'm like, well, these people both came out of nowhere. Like, that's really convenient.
Yeah,
why the fuck did they, like, you know what I'm saying? Like even Proud Boys came out of nowhere. And then, so later on, I started doing a little bit more research into the founder of the Proud Boys, which is Gavin McInnes. Gavin McInnes actually was a founder or co-founder of Vice News, which was primarily funded by the Canadian government. And Gavin McInnes' dad was one of the most prominent defense contractors in the Canadian government.
No shit.
So he, with all of his liberal clout and the clout that he got from Vice News, decides to, I want to start the Proud Boys and talk about punching fucking people I disagree with.
Yeah.
Then Proud Boys hits its prominence, right? Okay. Then he's like, well, now that it's high awareness, I'm just going to step away now. And then this guy Tario takes over, Cuban guy, white Cuban from South Florida, Gusano.
Right.
Now, on the other side of that fence, like I told you, I'm familiar with the real Antifa. I also know that the CIA tends to repackage shit because they're unoriginal and uninventive as fuck. They always use the same shit.
Yeah.
They always do it. Like with the Gucci, I don't know if you're familiar with the Gucci for shit. Like from the Russiagate thing, where they're like, Gucci for 2.0. So they took a real hacker's name, Gucci for, and just Gucci for 2.0. Because we don't know what the fuck to call shit. Because we don't know the hacking community well enough to come up with something original. So that's the same idea for Antifa. I also know they didn't believe in math. They believed in movement accountability. This group of Antifa did not. I also saw the way that the mainstream media, because I know how the mainstream media demonizes people. They didn't demonize Antifa. They actually demonized BLM, who Antifa was supposedly there to support. They said that, oh, we think Russians infiltrated the local BLM movements when they were reporting on the protests. But Antifa's good, though. And then I remember that fateful moment during the debates where Biden was like, first of all, Antifa isn't an organization. It's an idea. It's a movement. I was like, well, that seals it. And I text my friend Jack and I said, hey, bro, real quick, Antifa and Proud Boys are the same thing. And he was like, what? And so I told him about Gavin McInnes. And I'm like, yeah, I said, you know how they say Tario is like, he worked in the securities industry in South Florida? He's like, yeah, he's a Fed. He's like, well, how do you know that? I'm like, because I'm from the hood. I know a fucking Fed when I see one. So I said, once all this stops, all of a sudden, there's not going to be any Antifa. There's not going to be any Proud Boys. Both are going to be used to push some type of domestic terrorism agenda. And we're going to be fucked, basically. Yeah. So,
I mean, that goes back
Tario gets arrested 2 days before the January 6th incident with 2 high-powered magazines. His lawyer argues for it. So what that means is, one, they knew January 6th was coming and pretend like they didn't, right? There's that. But then 2, his lawyers argued in court that he was a fucking federal informant and that they should cut him some slack, FBI specifically informant, that they should cut him some slack. Meanwhile, Joe Biden gets elected, and on Inauguration Day, unlike with Donald Trump, Antifa is nowhere to be found and no one is hearing from them, and all of a sudden the riots disappear.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is exactly about the weaponization of racism that we've been talking about, that they just can create these organizations to fight each other, create this division, and all the while, we're not working together.
Yeah. But if I would have never, and the only reason I was basically the only one to have been able to figure that out is because, at least in my circle, even though there are obviously a lot more independent-minded and principally consistent than most, like, I'm the only one where it's damn near a disorder at this point, where it's like, there is no way that I can see all of these things be 100% true all the time, see it happen in this circumstance, and pretend like it's not there because emotionally I'm pulled one way or the other. right? Like I can't be like that. Or
Yeah.
because my brand is dependent on me leaning one way or the other. Or like all these other outside circumstances like that influence people or blind people to some degree on one or the other or towards one or the other. I couldn't do it. I'm like, bro, this is what it is. He's like, dog, like are you sure? I'm like, bro, yeah, I'm almost 100% positive. and all of it down to Tario literally being a fucking FBI operative, like all of it was true.
Yeah.
And I can only see it because applying consistent principles. When you do that, you can't not see shit like that.
Right.
You just can't. So that's why it's important.
Yeah, it becomes apparent the level of manipulation. Most people really can't believe it, but when you look into it, it's just, overwhelming mountains of evidence start to pile up where it's like, hey, these intelligence agencies really do have the power to create these kind of movements. The number of domestic terrorists or the Muslim terrorist attacks that happened. There was the story out of Mother Jones. This was years ago now, but that the FBI had basically set them all up to scare people into thinking that there was this huge terrorist problem in the United States and that Al Qaeda was around every corner.
So when people try to warn. So this is one of the things I learned about, so I understand from my studies of Central and South America that we don't allow actual refugees into our country, like not actual political refugees. To be frank, it's usually the white ones who are working on behalf of the puppet government that we were uplifting.
Right.
That's why all the Cubans in the U.S. are like white, but all the Cubans in Cuba are mestizo or black,
right.
Basically 70% of them. So and the same thing with Venezuela. People don't even know that black Venezuelans exist, but there's a shitload of them, and a lot of indigenous ones too. Same thing in Bolivia, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm thinking to myself, whenever they were doing that push in 2014 for all of the Syrian refugees to be allowed into the States, and it was welcoming them all with open arms and really weren't even vetting them all that well. And I'm thinking that's fucking weird. Since when do we allow actual refugees to come into our country? So then fast forward few years later, remember that terrorist attack that happened that turned out to be a Syrian refugee that was let in during the Obama era.
Right.
Because we don't let in actual refugees. We let in, some women and children get in, which is good, whatever. But the men who come here, generally speaking, they're probably going to be on the side of the empire. It's not because they're Muslim. It's not because they're Arabic. It's not because they're Syrian, but it's because they're on the side of the empire. In whatever form that may look like at the time that may be convenient to the empire itself. And that's what people need to start getting. Once again, I could have been emotional about that's fucking Islamophobic, da-da-da-da. It's no, I can't say this when it comes to Central South America. And then the moment that somebody throws out the word Muslim, all of a sudden my brain breaks.
Right.
It's fuck that. What is the situation and circumstance? Is this the same thing they've always done? Is there a reason, reasonably so, that this circumstance would be different? And if it is different, why is CNN talking about it like they talked about everything else? It's you can't ignore it, bro. And it turned out that's exactly what it is. So.
Well, right on, Niko. I better let you go. I think we could talk for hours. If we get on any more topics, we'll just keep on going. But I know you got places to go, people to see this afternoon.
Yeah.
So,
hey, man, I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, man. I hope it helped. I hope it helped.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was good. I got what I wanted out of it, and hopefully, maybe we'll get a chance to do it again sometime because I did like delving into your stuff, and I found that we have so much in common. I've been doing a lot of work, trying to understand how to kind of get the libertarians, because even once you kind of wake up, I think, to the workings, the machinations of the empire, we cling to the left-right paradigm so much because we identify one way or the other. And I keep trying to figure out how to get, libertarian minded people connected with progressive minded people to realize we all got to work together, whatever our differences are, if we're going to actually be able to mount some kind of defense against, this, what's been going on for so long, colonization really. But, how do we figure out how to message that?
The first question that you have to ask people is, why do we have the differences? Where do they come from?
Yeah.
Then when you ask that question, then you start doing some genuine, because there's going to be a surface level response, right? From what they think they know from the last 10, 15 years. Then there's going to be the next level response that you can really only get through friendship and conversations. Because there has to be a trust established instead of you
Totally.
assuming that a person's trying to fulfill a political agenda or get you to come over to their side. And then there's that third level where you do address, maybe generational trauma, history, in-depth history, things like that, that could be affecting their decision, even inadvertently. They don't know about it.
Yeah.
And once again, but the conversation has to start, and it has to start with why are we like this, not like what we should do next. Because, like, yeah, if you don't identify the correct problem, then how can you craft a solution to that problem?
Yeah.
So,
Right on, man. Well, you want to let people know where should I point them to find out more of your stuff? Where are you sending
so
people these days?
you can find me on YouTube. I guess at some point again, I'm suspended right now for the next week, but you can find me on YouTube. MCSC Network with Niko House, NIKOHOUSC. You can also find me on Rockfin, RLKFIN.com /Niko. On Twitter at Niko, NIKOCS, F as in Frank and B as in boy. And I'm on Instagram as well at Jimmy Hin, HEN Drip, DRIP.
All right, sounds good, man. Thanks for coming on. I'll just give a second to say that you have been listening to The Shift. I'm your host, Doug McKenty, and I'm actually still pointing people to my Facebook page. My personal page has the most followers right now, so if you kind of want to get involved, then just look up Doug McKenty on Facebook. I'm at D McKenty on Twitter. Those two, and I'm also on Rockfin. If you look up at The Shift Now or Doug McKenty, I'll come up on Rockfin, pointing people there. That seems to be actually a great venue for all of us these days. So.
Love Rockfin, man. Love them.
Yeah, right on. And so people can find me there. And of course, you can go to my website, www.theshiftnow.com, and sign up for the newsletter and get all the information from there. That's actually the best way to go. So thanks, everybody, for listening. And thanks, Niko, for coming on. Really appreciate it. Great conversation, man.
Thank you, man. You too, bro. Take it easy.
Yeah, you too. Well, all right. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That was my conversation with Niko House. That actually went better than I thought it was going to, right? I was a little bit nervous about getting in touch with him. I'd been wanting to have this conversation for a long time with an African American about racism so that we could really kind of try to cross that gap. I'm someone that was raised in white America. I did grow up in Houston. I went to a high school that was fairly representative of a multiplicity of cultures. There were African Americans, there were Hispanics at my high school, but I'll admit I mostly hung out with my white friends, people that were like me. I went to a college that was predominantly white, and now I live in a community that is probably 99% white. I'm about as white as it gets. And so when I started hearing about white privilege, and I started hearing about some of these other terms, systemic racism, critical race theory, these things, at first I was a little bit skeptical, just because I felt like there are a lot of poor white people too. Why do we have to separate things out of race? There are a lot of white people that are oppressed by the system. I'm not saying that African Americans and other racial groups aren't also oppressed by the system, but it doesn't seem to me that it has to be something that's so divisive. But I did, as I heard more and more about it, I realized that as a white person from a white background, I couldn't speak for an African American. I mean, I didn't know what their experience was like, and I thought what a great idea it would be to have an African American on the podcast that was in a position to really have an honest conversation about racial differences and how we feel about living in the United States. Me from the white person's perspective, and him from an African American perspective. And so when I discovered Niko, I thought, maybe this is the guy. And I sent him the email, and then I was like, it was so classic because I thought, is this guy going to think I'm just crazy? Was it even appropriate to kind of say, I want to have an uncomfortable conversation. I just want to lay it out on the table and see how you feel about things, But he got back to me. He said he was really excited about having the conversation. And then as we started talking, I mean, he actually said, right, he appreciated that I wanted to talk to an African American about their experience, and that he had seen so many people on TV over the last couple of years, white people talking about what it's like to be a person of color and what white people should do. Without inviting people of color to the table to have the conversation. And I think he appreciated the opportunity to really have that discussion. And then the more that I looked into him, It was, I realized, well, this guy's always kind of identified as left-leaning. I'm usually more of a libertarian, although I do consider myself a left libertarian. Are we going to get into this kind of left-right paradigm conflict? And not only on the racial issue was it phenomenal how much we agreed, but then even as we kind of talked a little bit more about politics, uh, it was just like I was like, I agree with everything that you say. I mean, we were really just hanging out, shooting the shit, having a mature conversation about how we feel about race and politics in the United States, and I thought we got along really well. I was really impressed with. I did not know before this conversation that he had a history in debate. And when he started talking about how, people, whether you agree with them or not, they at least have to have an argument from an internally consistent perspective, an integrated perspective. And that's something that I realized when I was studying philosophy, that it is important to at least have a worldview that's integrated and consistent. And if you're not coming from that place, then eventually you're just going to be a hypocrite. And so many people aren't willing to test their belief system to that place. And the fact that Niko has done that and has done that work for himself, it just made for a great conversation. He really was confident in his point of view, but he wasn't judgmental about mine. We were able to have an open and honest conversation about a variety of things. And when it came to the race issue, I think what was most impressive to me, or maybe even surprising, was how much we completely agreed. I mean, I thought there was going to be some kind of like disagreement from our perspectives, but I think we just have respect enough for each other's lived experience that we were curious to hear each other's points of view, and then it was amazing to find out how similar they were. I have done interviews in the past about redlining, and when I was doing research for this interview, I discovered that Niko also understands that, systemic racism, a lot of the issues that are in the African American community economically stem from the redlining that was done in the 40s and 50s by the Federal Housing Authority. So we weren't like getting into arguments about what happened in slavery times or, what the founding fathers thought or any of that, because he, like myself, realized that the generational wealth that most white people have now, they have because their parents bought houses in 1950 or their grandparents bought houses in 1950 that are now worth $1 million plus. And African Americans just weren't invited to that party. And so we were able to have a conversation about that. Their communities were segregated and ghettoized while the white communities were built up by these government systems. And that's clearly causing a lot of the economic disparities to this day. And it's not so much what's happening now. I mean, that's the thing about it. He also, when we brought up just the discussion about racism, it's not like I wasn't trying to say that racism didn't exist. And he had his own personal experiences that he shared with us in the conversation, right? About what's happened to him and the racism that he's dealt with. But he was willing to also kind of break it down and understand that everybody is an individual and everybody has a different relationship with race. And even amongst people of color, there are different segments of people that are racist against other segments of that community as well. So it's not just a black and white thing. And he perceived, as I do, that racism has really been weaponized to a great extent by the upper class, especially during the Trump era, to try to put down a lot of the populism that I think Niko, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but seems like since the Bernie Sanders primary scandal, he's becoming more and more open-minded. And that was another thing that it really resonated with me, because I've seen a lot of progressives after the Bernie Sanders primary. They really woke up to the corruption that's endemic in the political process, and they started to look at some of the quote unquote conspiracy theory stuff, or the more populist material that's now being branded as white supremacist or white nationalist by the mainstream media, and saying to themselves, like, actually some of this seems to make sense. And so we're incorporating what's really happening is that people from the left are leaving the left-right paradigm. People from the right are leaving the left-right paradigm, and we're starting to find this middle ground. And I really enjoyed that part of the conversation with Niko, where, I mean, it was actually surprising to me again that he didn't say anything that I disagreed with. I mean, he kind of self-identifies as progressive. I kind of self-identify as libertarian. And as far as I'm concerned, you know, we were right there when it came to what's going on racially in the country, when it came to the deep, deep corruption that we're seeing in the government corporate system. You know, I mean, more power to us, right? There was no reason, no conflict, no... So much of this is being weaponized, it's being fabricated, I think, and I think Niko would agree, to prevent people of color, communities of color, working and unifying with white communities across the country to fight the elitist system. You know, a unified populist uprising against the upper class. So that's... it seems like there should be no reason for this not to happen, frankly, but the mainstream media would have you think that all the white populists are just crazy white nationalist conspiracy theorists, far right-wing nut jobs, right? Another thing that I wanted to bring up with him, and I was really happy that he also just completely agreed with me about, which was this notion that so many establishment progressives, so many people on the left are constantly talking about diversity, 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 and we need to incorporate people of color into these educational institutions, into these corporate institutions, so that we have a quote-unquote more diverse culture, right? Not just this white supremacist culture where it's only white males that dominate the top of the hierarchy, which I've always seen as a form of assimilation. Like, if you really have respect for cultures of color that are different from the white culture, then maybe you'd be looking at learning from these other cultures and then incorporating those ideas into your own community, rather than, you know, to me, there's this inherent white supremacy in so much of the racial conversation that's happened by the very people who pretend to be anti-racist, because their ultimate goal, they're just assuming that the white corporate culture that has colonized the planet is clearly superior. And the assumption is so deep inside of themselves that they see anti-racism as being incorporating and assimilating people of color into this incredible white culture. Here's our white science and our white medical system and our white education system and our white corporate system, and you guys get your piece of the pie too, and isn't that great? But it's not great. You know, ask a Native American who's seen their culture be wiped out, or these African Americans who their history goes back to Africa. There's traditional African cultures going back for thousands and thousands of years that could be tapped into and learned from by people of European descent. And I'm not seeing any of these quote-unquote progressives or left-wing people who are pushing for quote-unquote racial equality learning about the history and the cultures and the traditions and the sciences that grew from those parts of the world. They just seem to have this assumption that assimilating people of color into the white man's path is clearly for their benefit. And it's a supremacist view. I thought it was going to be controversial. I brought it up with Niko, and he was like, no way, man, right there with me. And so I don't even know, you know, I don't even know what to say. This conversation went way better probably than I even expected it to. I really got along with Niko. I really thought that we covered a lot of the points about what's going on with the whole racial thing, what's been going on over the last couple of years. I think he saw through a lot of the anti-Trump, anti-populist rhetoric that was going on, that was weaponizing racism and even weaponizing his own community against a unifying uprising against the political class. So we couldn't have agreed with each other anymore. Niko is on his way out now to do a show for RT. He's moving on up to cable, so I'm really happy about that. And I was really happy that he had this conversation with me before he got super busy. I think that's going to be starting to air here in a couple of months. So I urge all of my listeners to check that out. And remember, you can go to www.rockfin.com/Niko. I think that's the best place to check out his stuff. Rockfin's been a great platform, a free speech platform for a lot of us. So if you haven't been there, go to rockfin.com and check it out. You can also find him on Twitter at NikoSFB, or on YouTube at Niko House and the MCSC Network. So you can find him there. Yeah, and I urge you to keep track of this guy. I really appreciated the conversation that we had, and I hope that we can have another one on into the future if he can find time from his new show on RT. So anyway, thanks everybody for listening. I hope you got as much out of this conversation as I did. You have been listening to The Shift. I'm your host, Doug McKenty. You can find all my stuff at www.theshiftnow.com. If you're not a subscriber, please think about subscribing for the full feature-length episodes of the show. If you just want to donate, there's a PayPal link on the website, and that link will be just below here in the show notes too. So if you want to support the show, you can do it there. I'd really appreciate it. You keep the shift going. And also think about signing up for the newsletter and checking out a lot of free content. Got a lot of extra shows, the Psychology of Lockdown series, the Facts and the Fiction, some older stuff, roundtable discussions, and my old show on public radio up there. Hundreds of hours of free content, so you can check it out, www.theshiftnow.com. All right. Thanks again, everybody. My next conversation is going to be with Sammy Richards, who has just started a new blog called Shifting Timeline, shiftingtimeline.com. And we are going to be talking about the two different kinds of consciousness that seems to be happening on the planet today, in terms of just that, it seems like people just have these totally different realities. There's the quote-unquote conspiracy theorists, and then there's those that follow the corporate media and the corporate system, and this particular bifurcation just seems to be getting wider and wider, so we'll go in deep on that. All right, thanks everybody. Hope to see you again for that conversation, and thanks a lot for listening to this one. You guys have a great day.